The topic for today is the Council of Europe. And I think many of you have some familiarity with the Council. I thought it might be interesting to give a bit of an historical presentation of what this organization is all about. It is not the oldest European organization, but it's the oldest big European organization. There are a few small ones that are older, but of the present big ones, the OSCE, European Union, etc., Council of Europe was the oldest one. And its origins go back to the immediate post-war period. After the Second World War, there was a very intense discussion in Europe on how to prevent what had happened to happen once more. The question of never again, how could we avoid a bloody, horrible conflict among European peoples, and also a disregard for human rights that had led to the massacre, to the murder of millions and millions of people all over Europe. So there was this discussion in post-war Europe about preventing a repetition of the war, securing peace and securing respect for human rights. As you know, at this time, the United Nations had just been formed, and a very early thing in the United Nations was the Declaration on Human Rights, which was exactly, as the name implies, a declaration. It was not a binding document. It was a declaration. It was a solemn declaration of intent. We intend to work for these rights. But the Europeans had the idea that perhaps we could make this a bit stronger. We could make it a convention, and we could create some instruments of control so that this would actually be observed. So what happened was that the founders of the Council of Europe, 10 states were founders, started immediately to draft a convention based on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And this became the European Convention of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. Attached to that convention was a Commission of Human Rights and a Court of Human Rights. The Commission was intended to be a first instance, and then the Court would be the second instance. Now, in the first few decades of the Council of Europe, this instrument didn't mean very much. There were a few cases before the Commission and the Court, but very, very few. And most of them were at this time interstate cases. In other words, one state having a complaint against another state, or sometimes several states complaining against another state. The individual right of complaint at the beginning was not compulsory. It was something that the states could accept, and it was slowly accepted by all states, but from the outset it was not accepted. And eventually the individual complaints came to be the predominant type of cases before the court. In the beginning, the judges and the members of the commission, they didn't live in Strasbourg. They came there every once in a while to look at an empty mailbox, or almost empty mailbox. I mean, there were sometimes complaints coming, but very few. But slowly, the number of complaints increased, and the very rather abstract character of the convention was filled out by concrete cases. There was a case law was formed, precedents, and these precedents gave the convention teeth, made it powerful, made it exact, and it meant that governments would know after a while what were the European standards that were defended by the Council of Europe. So the convention was one very important early development. Another development in the beginning was the setting up of what was called in the statute the Consultative Assembly, members of parliament from different member states coming together a couple of times every year to discuss common topics. Now this consultative assembly had a very interesting dynamic. It was not given much competence from the government, almost none. It was just said a consultative assembly giving advice. But slowly, successively, gradually, this consultative assembly grabbed more and more power and converted itself into a strong, relatively strong body. It eventually became the body that controlled the accession of new member states. Whenever a member state, an outside state wanted to become a member, the consultative assembly, the parliamentary assembly, had to be consulted. By the way, it rebaptized itself, calling itself Parliamentary Assembly. It didn't ask for permission. It just said, look, from now on, our name is Parliamentary Assembly. And the Committee of Ministers, which was the government's, they didn't accept that for a long time. So there were strange correspondence where the Parliamentary Assembly called itself Parliamentary Assembly, and in the reply, the Committee of Ministers said, Dear Consultative Assembly. But after a while, they gave up, and it was accepted as a Parliamentary Assembly. Anyway, the Parliamentary Assembly established itself as being the real decision maker on new member states. Before the dramatic events in 1989, 1990, 1991, when the map of Europe changed, it was essentially West European states that became members. The East European states, the Central European states, the ones that belonged to the Soviet bloc, could not join because there was a strong resistance from Moscow, from the Kremlin, that didn't prevent a few overtures, a few early steps taken by the East European states to form contacts. And in the last years of the old system, the various parliaments of Eastern Europe and Central Europe became invited guest members. Even the Supreme Soviet was an invited guest member at its last stage, and the German Volkskammer, East German Volkskammer, and the various parliaments in Eastern Europe, they started to come as guests, invited guests. And there was a discussion starting already in the late 80s about how European cooperation could develop once there had been steps to democracy all over the place. And of course, with the transformation, this intensified, and the various states in Central and Eastern Europe applied for membership and were eventually admitted. Poland, Hungary first, then the others. The new Russian Federation applied for membership, I believe, in 1992. It took considerable time for that application to be processed because there were a number of outstanding questions and problems. For all the new member states, all the candidate countries, there was a process of discussion, process of looking at the internal legislation, looking at the Council of Europe conventions that had been adopted to see whether there was a compatibility between the domestic national legal system and the standards of the Council of Europe. The conventional system, the conventions of the Council of Europe, could be divided into two groups. There are a few core conventions which are considered to be compulsory, must be ratified by all member states. They are the core. Whereas lots of others are optional. They can be ratified if you want. There are at present, I think, some 214 conventions. Russia, for example, has ratified around 60, I believe. Sweden around 90. So, I mean, different countries have gone in for different selection of conventions. And the idea is that this, on the one hand, apart from the core conventions that everybody is supposed to adhere to, It's up to every state to determine which parts of the cooperation do you want to be a member of. And the core conventions, what do they contain? Well, one core convention that was an absolute requirement for new member states in the 90s was the abolition of death penalty. That was a very sensitive matter, of course, because in most countries in Central and Eastern Europe, there was not the public opinion was not particularly keen on this. But governments in different ways nevertheless managed to get this through their parliaments and through because this was a condition for membership. And there were many other things that were conditions for membership. However, as Lena said, not everyone was happy about the extension, the enlargement of the Council of Europe. There was concern that many things were still lagging behind. Many traces of the past were still present in the old communist countries. So in addition to requiring certain minimum standards at the time of accession, eventually a system was invented to monitor the continued progress. A monitoring system was set up. The initiator was the Mrs. Tarja Halonen, who eventually became president of Finland. So this system was called the Halonen system. And a monitoring committee was set up. I think the Halonen system is now 20 years old. There's going to be a ceremony in May, in a couple of weeks' time, in Helsinki to celebrate the 20th anniversary of this monitoring system. As the system works, countries can go in and out of it. Sometimes you say, look, we are now satisfied with the situation in this country. We discontinue monitoring. But there are also cases where you can restart the monitoring process. One thing that happened, I think only 1 or 2 weeks ago, was that a decision was taken to restart monitoring of Turkey. As you know, there are many sad developments in Turkey when it comes to political rights, when it comes to freedom of expression and so on. And the Parliamentary Assembly has just decided to reintroduce monitoring of Turkey. Now, I have mentioned the European Convention on Human Rights. I mentioned the monitoring system. But in the Council of Europe system, there are many, many other specific, targeted control, monitoring, and follow-up systems. Over the years, there have been a number of specialized bodies invented to try to promote progress in different areas. And let me just give you some examples. There is something called ECRI, which is an expert group against racism and xenophobia. ECRI looks at different countries and sees what kind of problems do they have in the field of xenophobia and racism. And this body gives targeted, specific advice to governments and parliaments. What could be done? It takes a position that you cannot always do this by one size fits all. I mean, you cannot have one single solution to all problems. You must look specifically at the situation of different countries and give specific recommendations. So that is what they do. Another body, specialized body, is the European Commission Against Torture and Degrading Treatment. Essentially a body that is trying to follow what's happening in closed institutions like prisons, police stations, psychiatric wards, and so on. This committee consists of specialists of various kinds. Some are lawyers, some are doctors, some are experts in penitentiary institutions, and these people go around and make inspections in different countries. And when they have been to different countries, they come back with a report. The report is not made public first. It's sent to the government. And then there is a dialogue, a discussion with the government. What can you do to improve the situation in your country? And then eventually, sometimes this report may be made public. But the basic purpose of this body is not to sort of say that this or that government is bad. It is rather to see what can be done practically on the field to improve conditions that are not satisfactory. And they try to look at all countries. I remember an inspection going to Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is not known as a great horror in terms of human rights, but they looked at the police station in Liechtenstein and noticed that there was one single prisoner there, and he was left locked in overnight. There was no guard on duty. So the man who was locked in could possibly suffer problems of some kind. So again, a complaint with the Liechtenstein government, and I hope the situation was solved. But I mean, I gave this example to say that it is not. I mean, there are countries in Europe that have worse problems than Liechtenstein, and this commission is trying to go into dialogue to solve such problems. There is apart from the Parliamentary Assembly, there is a very interesting sister institution called the Congress of Regional and Local Government. So people from various local communes and regions come together to discuss their problems. Very often problems that have to do with the relations between local government and the central powers. The Congress, of course, assembles people who have very, very different. They have very different functions. You may have the minister from Bavaria is one of the German Länder, one of the German states. I mean, the German Länder can have up to 17 million inhabitants. But so a minister from a German Land may sit next to a mayor from a French commune of 200 inhabitants. Clearly, these people have different problems, but the idea of this assembly is to discuss various problems of local government and regional government in Europe. There is something called the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission, again, was invented by an Italian. The Italian, he managed to convince the government of Italy and the province of Veneto, which is where Venice is, and this town of Venice, to finance the operation. So they have their headquarters, they meet in Venice. The Venice Commission consists of legal constitutional experts from the member states. And they come together and try to help countries solving different constitutional issues and issues related to citizens' rights. This is again another example. Then there are committees dealing with healthcare, dealing with education, dealing with various fields of government. There, very often, you have different formula. Sometimes it's governmental experts, governmental representatives. Sometimes it's experts appointed by the governmental committees. So the whole system is a huge complex of different bodies. Some bodies related to the Committee of Ministers, which is the governmental side, others related to the parliamentary side. And when I say the governmental side, I should add one thing. The supreme body of the Council of Europe is something called the Committee of Ministers, meaning the Committee of Foreign Ministers. But the foreign ministers, of course, are not so often in Strasbourg. There are meetings once or twice every year where the ministers come together. But in between their meetings, there is something which is called the Committee of Ministers, but which is actually called the representatives of the ministers. That's the ambassadors. There are now ambassadors in Strasbourg on a permanent basis. They are there all the time. They meet every week to take care of different issues. And one of the issues they take care of is the question of implementation and respect, compliance with the court's decisions. Because the court, which has now become essentially a court dealing with individual complaints, very often says that country X, country Y, country Z has done wrong and should pay a compensation to this private person who has been treated badly by the system. And these sentences are not so enthusiastically greeted, I can tell you, by the governments. They are respected. Eventually they are respected. But it takes some time before they are respected. It takes a lot of confrontation, a lot of nagging, a lot of peer pressure, political pressure from the other states. And if a country refuses to comply with the decision of the court, that will be on the agenda of the Committee of Ministers forever. I mean, it will continue to be. There will be continued discussion about this matter for a very, very long time. Eventually, most countries tend to comply. Of course, as I said, the governments are not always enthusiastic. Now, some governments are even less enthusiastic than others. And there are, I would think, Russia and the United Kingdom belong to those who are have been most violently critical. But Turkey is also quite critical, and a few others. So you have a lot of criticism. You have, and when all these committees, specialized committees, looking at torture and looking at this and that, come with their reports, of course there are frequently negative comments by the governments. They say, look, they are wrong, they have unfounded allegations, this is not an objective judgment, etc. A lot of dialogue goes on where criticized governments fight back. But eventually, I would say that criticism has a strong effect. It may take some time. There may be some noise before but the general pattern over time is that these criticisms are nevertheless, they affect the behavior of governments. Not, I mean, with delays, with long delays, but they have some it has some impact. Is it? I mentioned this question of people, of governments being admitted as new members. By now, all European governments, states are members, with one exception, and that's Belarus. Belarus was a candidate for membership in the 90s, but the process was interrupted, and Belarus has never become a member. There is, of course, very often the question, doesn't the behavior of country X, Y, and Z, hasn't that deteriorated to the point that where the country should be kicked out? If you don't respect the standards, can you really still be a member? This question is up every once in a while. There have been cases where countries have been suspended from this or that. Turkey was out of the Parliamentary Assembly for a while. Greece, when there were military dictators in Greece, was suspended also. Russia, as you may know, has lost its vote in the Parliamentary Assembly for some time because of Crimea. And there are other cases where where the Council of Europe takes action to try to convince countries to play by the rules. So far, no country has been suspended permanently. And I frankly believe that this is probably counterproductive, because as long as you can talk to each other, as long as you can discuss these matters, it's useful nevertheless, even if there are people among the 46 members that do not fully respect the rules. And I would say no country is entirely free of criticism. There are all problems all over the place, of course, more or less serious. the idea is that as a forum to discuss democracy, human rights, and rule of law issues, this nevertheless fulfills a very important function. So I should stop here, I think. We could just go into discussion, question and answers. The Council, let me just round off by saying that it is now a body with some, okay, thanks. I was going to add just a final sentence. This is not a very rich organization. It is financed, as Lena said, by member states. It has some 2,000 employees by now, dealing with various conventions. There are many myths about the money that's being paid for the Council of Europe. It's based essentially on gross national product and population. There's a formula for it. And it's true, exactly as Lena said, that there are 5 states that are called to be the big payers. That's UK, Germany, France, Italy, and now also Russia. That doesn't mean that they pay more than they should have. It's just that these 5 countries have agreed that they share their collective dues in an equal fashion, which means that the poorer of these countries subsidize the richer ones. But the payment otherwise for these countries also, it follows for the 5 countries collectively, it follows the standard formula of population plus GDP.